My uncle stood at the head of that conference table and told 12 people, including 2 who had watched me stack canning jars in the warehouse since I was 7 years old, that I confused sentiment with strategy. He said I cared too much about what this company had been to ever understand what it needed to become. He said I was 32 years old and still thinking like a founder's granddaughter instead of a businesswoman. Then, 4 years after the afternoon he had my chair removed from the boardroom, he called me himself, voice quiet in a way I'd never heard from him, and asked me to come back. I was sitting in the parking lot of Hollis House Provisions the morning the board finally called, staring at the brick building my grandmother had converted from a cannery in 1981 with a $14,000 SBA loan and 27 years of stubbornness. I hadn't been inside since the week they voted me out. My name is Thalia Brent, and until that call came, I'd spent 4 years training myself not to need anything from that building, or anyone in it. My grandmother, Grandma Fern, started Hollis House in a Columbus suburb with 3 recipes she'd refined over the better part of a decade: a pepper jelly, a tomato chutney, and a blackberry preserve that her church group had been asking her to sell commercially since the early 70s. By the time I was growing up, the business had outgrown the converted cannery twice and was stocking shelves in regional grocery chains across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. My father joined the company in his 20s, eventually took over operations when Grandma Fern stepped back from day-to-day management, and spent the next 20 years turning a local institution into something that could actually pay its 40-odd employees a living wage and health benefits. My uncle Roger was my father's younger brother. He'd come into the business later after a career in commercial real estate that ended when the market shifted in ways he hadn't prepared for. My father brought him in out of loyalty. They were close, the way brothers can be when there's enough distance between them, and gave him the director of sales title and a corner office, and the benefit of every doubt a blood relative deserves. When my father died, Roger stepped into the CEO role before the funeral arrangements were finalized. I don't say that to be ugly about it. There was a succession plan, the kind that lives in a folder in a filing cabinet, because nobody actually believes they'll need it before they're 80. My father had talked to the board about me taking over the product and sourcing division once I finished my MBA. I was 32 in a year from finishing my degree. I'd spent 3 summers working directly under my father, learning how vendors were evaluated, how quality thresholds were set, how our production timelines connected to our retail contracts. I knew this business. I knew it the way you know something when you've loved it your whole life and paid attention while doing it. Roger knew something different. He knew how to walk into a room and make it feel like the room had been waiting for him. The board meeting happened 6 weeks after my father's funeral. I sat through the first 40 minutes without speaking, because Roger had structured the agenda so that my role would come up last. After 2 hours of quarterly projections and a vendor renegotiation proposal that I had actually written the first draft of. When my name finally came up, Roger stood, adjusted his jacket, and delivered what I can only describe as a performance. He told them I was talented. He said it with the specific warmth of someone who has practiced being generous before delivering bad news. He said I had my grandmother's instincts for the product and my father's feel for the kitchen floor, and that both of those things were genuine assets to this company, in the right role. But leadership, he said, required a kind of dispassion that he wasn't sure I'd developed yet. He said I was still seeing the company through the lens of someone who grew up in it. He said he worried I would protect what Hollis House had been at the expense of what it needed to become. He said all of this to people who had watched him arrive 9 years earlier, after his real estate career collapsed, and call in a family favor. Nobody said that part out loud. 3 weeks later, a bylaw amendment was passed at a meeting I wasn't notified about until it was already over. My advisory seat on the board was dissolved. The phrasing in the documentation was something like, restructured to reflect current operational priorities. I found out from a board summary email that I was copied on by mistake. So I left. I drove home from that parking lot and spent a weekend deciding what I was actually going to do. I thought about lawyers. I thought about calling my grandmother, who was in her mid-80s by then and had begun stepping back from the business for health reasons. I thought about calling her and telling her what had happened and letting her see what her younger grandson had done with her life's work. I decided against both, not because I was afraid. Because I understood even then that the only thing Roger could do with a screaming match or a premature lawsuit was use it to confirm everything he'd already said about me. I took a job at a regional food distribution company in Cleveland, then a quality assurance role at a specialty grocery chain in Cincinnati. Over 4 years, I learned distribution logistics from the inside out. I learned what retail buyers actually looked for in a vendor, and why they quietly dropped one when the relationship started costing more than the margin justified. I learned how to read a balance sheet the way my grandmother used to read a recipe, not for what it said on the surface, but for what was hidden underneath. I earned a certification in food manufacturing operations on evenings and weekends, finishing the coursework in a Holiday Inn meeting room in Akron on a February Saturday when I had honestly rather been anywhere else. I told my friends I was moving on. I told myself the same thing. I wasn't moving on, I was building a file. There were nights, more than I like to admit, when I almost undid all of it. Usually around 11 o'clock, usually after I'd spent an evening reviewing something at work that reminded me of a process my father had taught me. A receiving protocol, a batch log format, a vendor scoring system I'd seen first in our warehouse in Columbus, set up by my father on a legal pad he'd taped to the inside of a supply cabinet because he believed systems should be visible to the people using them. I would pick up my phone and find Roger's contact and just hold it there. Not to threaten him, not even to argue. Just to ask why. To ask if he had actually believed what he said in that boardroom, or if it had simply been the most convenient story available when he needed the room to himself. I never called. I put the phone down every time. I reminded myself that why didn't change anything that had already happened. What mattered was what I could document. The first signal that something was wrong at Hollis House came from my cousin Deanna, who worked in accounts payable, and called me every few months with a kind of guilty regularity, the way you check in on someone you know you failed to defend at the moment it counted. She mentioned, almost in passing, that the company had taken a second line of credit against the Columbus facility. Then she mentioned that Roger had replaced 2 of our longtime production managers with people who had come from a commercial kitchen equipment company, people who, as far as Deanna could tell, had never worked in specialty food manufacturing in their lives. Then she told me that one of our largest retail accounts, a regional grocer we'd supplied for 11 years, had quietly reduced their order volume by 40% without any public explanation. I told Deanna I didn't want specifics. I told her not to send me anything, not to risk her position on my behalf. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already begun pulling public records on my own. There's a significant amount you can find if you know how to look and have the patience to look carefully. SEC filings, UCC lien records, county court documents, supplier dispute disclosures, contractor dispute filings. It's tedious work. It requires a familiarity with financial language that I'd spent 4 years deliberately building. Over the course of about 8 months, I assembled a picture that was incomplete but coherent. Hollis House was carrying substantially more debt than its revenue trajectory could support, and some of that debt appeared to move through vendor relationships that hadn't existed before Roger took over. I needed someone who could make that picture legible to a board. A colleague at the grocery chain connected me with a forensic accountant named Claudia Morrow, who had spent a dozen years doing exactly this kind of above-board, public records-only financial review for parties in commercial disputes. I was clear with her from the beginning about what I wanted and what I didn't. Nothing proprietary, nothing that would put any Hollis House employee at legal risk, nothing that could be characterized as anything other than a careful reading of what was already publicly available. She said that was fine. She said it would take time. She told me to let her work. She came back to me 4 months later with a report that was 72 pages long. What she found wasn't dramatic in the way people expect financial misconduct to be dramatic. There were no offshore accounts, no obvious forgeries, no moment where someone in the document said the quiet part loud. What there was, instead, was a pattern. $2.1 million in company liabilities that had been restructured through a logistics and supply vendor called Terra Route Fulfillment, a company incorporated 18 months after Roger became CEO and connected, through 2 layers of LLC ownership to a man named Dale Price, who was, according to publicly available records, Roger's college roommate and a longtime personal friend. The arrangement wasn't provably illegal. Claudia was careful to say that more than once, and I appreciated the precision. What it was instead was the kind of thing that looks very different when you put it in front of people who had been told the company's financial deterioration was simply the result of market headwinds and strategic reinvestment. It was the kind of thing that answers questions nobody had thought to ask, because nobody had been watching closely enough to ask them. I didn't contact Roger when I received the report. I didn't forward it anywhere. I waited. I waited because I knew the moment when the people around Roger would stop extending him. The benefit of the doubt would come when the company's primary line of credit came up for annual review. Banks renewing credit facilities ask for real transparency, not the kind that gets packaged in a boardroom presentation, but the kind that shows up in raw documents. I knew that review was scheduled for spring. I waited for spring. It was Deanna who called me in February, crying on a Tuesday afternoon when I was on my lunch break in a parking garage in Cincinnati. She wasn't calling with intelligence or an update. She was calling because she had just sat through an all-hands meeting where Roger had been vague about the company's finances in the specific way that terrified everyone who understood what vague meant in that context. She was frightened, not for me, not strategically, just genuinely scared that she and 13 other people she cared about were going to lose their jobs before the year was done. I told her I had been waiting for that call. Not Roger's call, hers. I drove to Columbus that weekend to see Vernon Haas. Vernon was 81, Grandma Fern's original business attorney, and a quiet early investor who had stayed on the board in an emeritus capacity that was mostly ceremonial at this point. He was still sharp. More importantly, he was the one person in the founding generation of that company whose voice Roger could not dismiss or reframe or wait out. I brought the report to his house on a Sunday afternoon and set it on his kitchen table, the way you put something down when you need another person to feel its weight before they open it. He read the whole thing without asking me questions. He got up once to refill his coffee, came back, and kept reading. When he finished, he set the report down, smoothed the cover page flat with one hand, and looked at me over his reading glasses for a long moment. "Did you put this together yourself?" I told him about Claudia. I told him it was entirely public records, entirely legal, every source documented in the footnotes. He picked up his phone that afternoon and called 2 board members. He called a third the following morning. By Wednesday, an emergency board session had been scheduled for the following week. I was not asked to present. I didn't need to be. Vernon had been on that board before Roger was old enough to sign a commercial contract, and when Vernon Haas asked a room to pay attention, the room paid attention. The session lasted 4 hours. By the time it ended, Roger had been asked to step back from operational authority, pending a full independent audit, and 2 outside board members had formally requested his resignation as CEO. Roger came to my apartment 6 days later. He hadn't called ahead. I opened the door and he was standing on the landing in a jacket I recognized from years of holiday dinners, and he looked. I want to be precise about this. Like a man who had spent 6 days deciding how to frame something as someone else's fault, and had not quite settled on the framing yet. "You've been building this for 4 years, he said. It wasn't really a question, just sitting out there collecting pieces, waiting for the right moment. I was sitting out there, I said, learning how to do the job you told the board I wasn't capable of. He tried a different approach. He said I could have come to him directly. He said if I'd had concerns about the company's direction, a phone call would have accomplished more than 4 years of what he called positioning. He said we were family, and family handled things internally. I had thought about this moment a great deal. I had thought about it in parking garages and on late drives home and at my kitchen table with Claudia's report open in front of me. I had run through 100 versions of what I might say. And when the moment was actually in front of me, I found I only had the energy for the true thing. "Roger," I said, "you told a room full of people that I was too emotional to lead this company. And then you spent 4 years making every major financial decision based on what was convenient for you and Dale Price." I paused. "That's not strategy. That's just what you had instead of one." He tried one more angle, the way people do when argument stops working and they still haven't found the door. He brought up my grandmother. He said she had built Hollis House for the whole family, not for any one person to turn into a personal grievance. He said Grandma Fern would not have wanted this. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her in that converted cannery in 1981, with her 3 recipes and her SBA loan, mortgaging her house not once but twice over the following decade to keep the company alive through downturns that could have finished it. I thought about what she would say if she could see the Terra route contracts. Grandma Fern built this thing from nothing because she believed in it, I said. She would be heartbroken by $2.1 million in debt she can't account for. I think you know that better than I do. He left without answering. It was the last real conversation we had. The audit took 3 months. It confirmed what Claudia's report had outlined and surfaced several additional vendor arrangements that hadn't been visible in public records alone. Terra Route Fulfillment lost its contracts with Hollis House within 6 weeks of the audit's interim findings. Dale Price was notably quiet throughout the process. According to Vernon, his attorney had advised him that any legal action would only generate more scrutiny than the situation could withstand. A loss Roger had vaguely referenced as a possibility never materialized. Winning back the retail accounts that had pulled volume was harder and took longer than anything else. I want to be honest about that because the story is easier to tell if you leave that part vague, and the real version isn't vague. 2 accounts didn't return at all. The 11-year relationship with our largest regional grocer was partially restored, but it required 8 months of direct conversations and a reformulated production timeline, and some genuine humility about the quality inconsistencies that had developed under the previous management, before they would commit to anything in writing. Deanna was promoted to accounting manager in the reorganization. Several production staff members who had been quietly job hunting decided to stay. Roger retained his equity stake. There was no clean legal mechanism to address it, and pursuing one would have consumed resources the company needed for actual operations. He stepped back entirely from any role at Hollis House. The board offered me the COO position 4 months after the audit closed. I accepted on one condition. I wanted my father's succession plan, the version that had lived in a filing cabinet and never been formalized, put into writing and ratified by a board vote before I signed anything. Vernon made it happen. He came in person to the ratification vote, which was more than his health comfortably allowed at that point. I hadn't asked him to. He just showed up. The morning I came back to Hollis House officially, I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. Not because I was as uncertain. I just wanted to mark the moment. The way you stand at the edge of something before walking forward, to acknowledge that you understand what you're doing and why. The production kitchen smelled exactly as it always had. The warm, faintly acidic scent of cooked fruit and vinegar, and something underneath both of those things that I'd never been able to name, but had always understood as the smell of the company itself. The smell of something real that had been built by someone who meant it. Grandma Fern's original recipe cards were in the archive cabinet in the back hallway, in the same green tin box they'd been in since I was a child. The formulas had been updated over the years, scaled up, adjusted for equipment changes, modified for certain ingredient substitutions. But the cards were there. Her handwriting was still on them. I stood with that box for longer than I needed to. My uncle once told a boardroom that I confused caring about something with knowing how to run it. He wasn't entirely wrong about who I was at 32. I was someone who loved this company and hadn't yet built the specific vocabulary to explain that love as a form of expertise. What he was wrong about was believing that those things couldn't coexist, couldn't grow into each other, couldn't eventually become the same thing in someone who was paying attention. What he was wrong about was thinking I would stay 32. I didn't come back to Hollis House to prove something to Roger. I'm aware that sounds like the thing people say when they mean the opposite, so I want to be accurate. By the time I walked through that door with my name on the COO paperwork, whatever I'd needed to prove to Roger had already been settled in 72 pages that I never had to deliver myself. I came back for the work. For the pepper supplier in New Mexico, who had been overcharging us on 2-year-old contract terms, because nobody had looked at the original agreement. For the Monday morning meetings with Deanna, going through the numbers line by line the way my father had taught me. No assumptions. No rounding in the direction of comfort. For the recipe cards in the green tin box. For the 40 people who came in every day and did their jobs well, for a company that deserved to be run by someone who understood what it was. You can be told you are not serious enough, not dispassionate enough, not ready, and still be right about the thing they're telling you you're wrong about. That's what Roger's speech in that boardroom could never account for. He could call a vote. He could dissolve a seat. He could restructure a bylaw on a Tuesday afternoon while I wasn't in the room. He couldn't change what was true. 4 years is a long time to hold your patience as a strategy. There were nights I nearly called him. There were mornings I drove past the company's retail outlet and had to make a deliberate choice about what that meant and what it didn't. But patience, I'd come to understand, is not the same thing as absence. Sometimes patience is the most exact instrument you have, the one precise enough to get underneath something and show you exactly what's there, without disturbing the evidence. Roger told a boardroom I wasn't serious enough to lead. I spent 4 years becoming the most serious person in the room. I put that into 72 pages of sourced, documented, legally obtained fact, and I handed it to Vernon Haas on a Sunday afternoon and let the truth do what truth does when someone finally stops looking away from it. That turned out to be all the argument I ever needed to make.